So my name is Megan Fitzgerald. I work with family treatment courts across Washington as the training coordinator. And these meetings are really to open up our opportunities, particularly for our rural courts, to have discussions and create cross links across counties, knowing that a lot of our courts are there are just challenges in rural court areas that are not the same in Seattle or Spokane. So, and this topic area was thinking about how we can generate cross-jurisdictional partnerships. And we all know that can come from a wide variety of different areas. But for today, because we're working with family treatment courts, we're mostly going to focus on cross-county relationships, knowing that there is a lot of work being done with tribal and court relationships, and I can guide you to other resources about that. And we can learn a lot from those relationships. They've been kind of longstanding. So what I'm going to do today is start us off with, first of all, I put this slideshow or short PowerPoint up on our website. Gia, if you wouldn't mind putting that link into the chat, you can go onto our website and pull out those slides if you like. And then our agenda's up on there too, so that might make it a little bit easier for you to find things, just in case something goes weird as we're talking today, or because sometimes it's a little bit easier for us to chat with each other if you can see the questions and things that we're talking about. So what I'd like for the 5 of you, 6 of you to do, I guess, is first of all, put your county and your name into the chat, and then think about one word, identify a benefit to working with groups, cohorts, or teams, and then add those to the chat. So that might be from your framework, but it'll also help guide me to some areas that we want to talk about. So I'm going to give you just 30 seconds to do that. One word, benefits to working in groups. Okay, so I see brainstorming, perspectives, communication, ideas, collaboration. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so we're in a pretty much on the same page here. Didn't mean to click on that. So sorry. If you put a link in your slides, they're immediately going to pull up the website. So while I'm pulling back my slides real quick, so a couple of things. Number one, if you tried to make it to this last week and you weren't able to come, I apologize. I had COVID pretty hard for 3 weeks, and you can hear it in my voice. I'm still not 100%. My brain is very slow, so very, very sorry. Please be patient with me. So I like to start these meetings and really recommend starting any meeting thinking about the assumptions that we're putting together as we're working together. So I assume that most of you folks are working from a rural area, and I can see that's pretty much true from looking at where you're coming from, and that those rural areas tend to have lower populations. They tend to have issues of geographic dispersal, and that those are generally the main issues that we focus on when we're talking about our rural roundtable areas. And then I also really make the assumption, that's okay. Thank you so much for joining us for a little bit, Jonathan. Appreciate it. And then the other assumption that I have to make is that we're really all looking for ways to better help families, right? So I take that assumption and I always say it as much as I can out loud, because even when we have differing opinions about things, I think it's really important to remember that that's where we're from. Yeah, limited jurisdiction and superior courts is absolutely an area that I'd be super happy to bring up and talk about as well. So thank you for bringing that up. So then from there, I just want to establish a baseline of like the things, why the resources I put together, the thinking that I'm putting together, and where those come from are based on issues that have come up over the last 2 years that our courts have shared with us, whether that's through looking over results from the National Evaluation of Family Treatment Courts, the NEFTC. We have results from those, or whether it's from various surveys and things that I've done of you all. And then I pulled out the ones that seem the most relevant to rural courts. So I want to take a second and go through those, and then also give you the opportunity to bring up other things that you think might be relevant. And this is really thinking about not just what's relevant to rural courts, but also what's relevant and might be useful if we create partnerships outside of just our one court in our one county. Um, so one of them is too few resources. And I actually think that this is probably the area where our courts mostly do the best job, right? So most of the time we see, partially because DCYF has regions and so they can work across regions, but also just people asking about treatment beds, people asking about parenting plans, going to whatever bed is open and getting housing resources across those places. So I think that I would say that most courts do a relatively good job of this. I know it's hard because there isn't like a steady repository where you can find out that information, but I think the community of people tends to bring that information together. Might be wrong, but that's pretty much what I've heard. And then issues of too few professionals or under-resourced professionals, I think is a huge one. So, from my perspective, working with courts across the state, I would say that the people that are under time capacity tend to be court professionals. So the coordinators and the judges have very little time on their hands to bring on new projects, and oftentimes are playing many different roles. And then the parent attorneys are sometimes going all across different counties and different places. There's being in court in different days of the week and all over the place, trying to meet with all of their families and do a really good job while they're caring about themselves and their team and their other things. DCYF, same thing. We know that DCYF is at a critical level of under-resourced, and sort of high employee turnover. And the same thing counts for them. So going to court 4 or 5 days a week because they're on a family treatment court team, and then also going to dependency court can be really challenging for them. And then this is the one that we worry about the most at the state level, is thinking about executive committee meetings. So many of our courts, especially our rural courts, are not having regular meetings outside of staffings. And it is one of the best practices, and it's sort of high up in the best practices. It's like best practice one talks about these executive committees. And there's a balance there where you need to be having conversations outside of just your staffing so that you're creating policies and procedures, so that you're looking for racial equity in your policies and procedures. So you're looking for areas where there might be disparities in care, so that you're generating ideas just like a collaborative cohort does. But on the other side of that, who wants to have another meeting, how can we bring together those people, who's going to come and show up during those times, and that's really, really challenging. Too few participants in your courts is particularly challenging for rural areas. Some of our counties have a new dependency every month, just one. And so then if you're trying to bring in an FTC, knowing that you have 1 or 2 or 3 participants, then it's really hard to establish a team of participants and a team of people to support them. And you start to get into that imbalance where you feel like you have too many professionals and not enough participants. Alumni, yeah, so fewer than 1 dependency per month is not uncommon, right? So I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing, but it does mean when you're trying to think about a group that's supposed to be really supporting each other as they come into the therapeutic court setting, then it can be a real challenge. Alumni groups or long-term support. We know that this is a real issue, especially as we're thinking about case timelines. So, the timeline on most recovery literature that I've looked at is about a year at the most or at the least. So, if you're in services, supported recovery services for up to a year, then you're more likely to have long-term stable recovery. None of our courts get to see people in recovery for a full year because the case is already gone by the time they reach that stability. So that can be really challenging. And one of the places where that comes in is alumni groups. But again, if you've got 1 participant, that's not a group, that's a person, that's 1 alumni. So that's challenging. And that goes into lack of continuity of services before or after FTCs. And we've talked about that a few times pre-dependency work. I know Snohomish is working on that post-dependency work, and trying to think about ways to do that. And then, cultural groups and expertise. I'll talk about that in a second. I mentioned capacity of court staff, needing for additional training. It's hard to get training in when you have such small teams that are really relevant and applicable. And also just the cost of training can be a difficulty. Communication, you all brought up various types of communication within groups, and then understanding of roles and responsibilities. And this one I see as a training professional in particular, where the more that you can see how other teams are doing roles, then the more that you understand your job. And it might not be that you change your job, but it means that you understand your job better. Right. So if you see that the coordinator in Skagit County is doing one thing and the coordinator in Okanagan County is doing something entirely different, their jobs don't even match, then you can start thinking about, like, what does this job look like? Like, what is my role on this team? How can I change that? Or is this meeting the best practice standards? And asking questions as opposed to just sort of going with what's happening already. And just making sure that you have an understanding of what you need. So some of the things that from my perspective, so my background is in group learning. It's in group learning in spiders, which I know everyone always laughs about it, but from the perspective of like I a behavioral scientist, when you think about how people learn, how animals learn from each other, how spiders learn from each other, there are these themes that go through that. And as I was learning about how groups find each other and what the possible benefits of finding other individuals are, some of the same things really ring true no matter what type of groups we're talking about. So spiders will go into these massive webs with each other in order to learn where the best food sources are. Right. So you have these older spiders that know how to catch food better. They know how to make a better web. Well, if you have another younger spider that joins in, they can learn from that adult spider. We see that in learning from adult perspectives as well. We also know that as you create participant groups, you have more belonging. Right. We know that our systems tend to be fairly uniform in our backgrounds, right? Every once in a while you have some diversity of characteristics, but a lot of the time our fields in anything dealing with child welfare tend to be very female centric. They tend to be very Caucasian, and they tend to be educated, because you can't get into this work unless you've had a higher level of education. When you're building a cohort of participants, you have more people that are interacting that have come from different backgrounds. And so that means that you're more likely to see someone who looks like you, who talks like you, who has the same background as you. And on top of that, when you're talking about creating belonging for people who are not professionals, when you're not in a professional setting, you don't have to do as much faking it, right? So when you're outside of those traditional roles and norms, and I can speak to this from, so my personal experience growing up really poor, there are certain things that I can say that I'm like, oh, everybody gets that. Like one of the first dates that I had with my partner, we both realized we grew up poor because I said something about government cheese as a kid. And he was like, oh yeah, I know about government cheese, because there were these blocks of cheese you got in the 80s because of dairy farming being this thing. And you got your blocks of cheese. It was a whole thing. I had a lot of cheese as a kid, but I also was from Wisconsin. So, so thinking about how that belonging plays in, where most of the time you put on a face, you're professional, you wear your suits, you go to court, you do your thing. And then every once in a while you hear those stories and you're like, oh, you get my experience. Like I hear that. And that creates a sense of belonging in our participants just as much as it does our professional teams and all of the people that we work with. So thinking about cohorts as a belonging model is a really important one. We talked about recovery capital in these meetings in the past. I know most people have some idea of what this is, but really it's thinking about building a new life after recovery. Because when you think about the communities that are involved in active substance use, a lot of the community models are broken down. And so we can take recovery capital to mean all of the bits and pieces that a healthy person would have learned from childhood and move forward on. And now we have to rebuild all of those. And one of the big pieces of this is community. Some of it is self-worth, some of it is like, emotional regulation. There's all these different metrics, but a lot of them have to do with new relationships. How can we build healthy relationships? And recovery capital is a part of this cohort learning model. And then recovery timelines. I mentioned this. Recovery is not a process that we can fit within the typical dependency timeline model. It lasts beforehand. There's work that happens beforehand or afterwards, and it doesn't really work with that cohort model. But if we're thinking about building cohorts and building new and changed communities of people that support each other, then we can have some overlapping learning after we sort of legacy learning after we graduate those participants. So these are sort of ideas and thoughts that are coming from the field, and there's lots of different thinking and ideas about how we do this. And then I wanted to just introduce specifically some principles of adult learning. This may or may not be interesting to you, but I think it's really good to think about as we're thinking about what the benefits are. And there are two different frames of references here, right? One, we're thinking about our team. How are we teaching each other? How are we learning from each other? How are we building ourselves as a team to be a strong team to support our participants? And then on the other side is how our participants learn, how they change, how they grow. So, these principles were developed in 1980 and they've been changed and modified since then, but they're still pretty research backed, pretty true, where you have these basic ideas of self-concept, what we call the adult learning experience, readiness to learn, orientation to learning, and motivation to learn. And these are not necessarily the same exact ideas as we see when we're talking about like therapeutic responses. The meanings aren't the same. So I'll talk about them a little bit. Self-concept is the idea that children are really dependent learners, but adults tend to be independent learners. So we already have a way that we like to learn, and we know that, and we tend to dig into that. And it's both a crutch, and it helps us and supports us and gets us to where we need to go. And it's also a crutch that is hard to let go of. And so when we know how we like to learn, we don't really want to change that. And this can really play a big role in our participants learning because they have these things that they know and they really truly believe. And they may not always be the best way to learn, but they are the way that they know how to learn. So we have to work with that and help them to direct their own process, as opposed to just telling them the right way to do it. This idea of an adult learning experience is really thinking that adults, more than children, need to connect their past experiences to their current experiences, or to anything that happens, new ideas, new concepts. And if they don't do that connection, that's both like an internal mental and an emotional connection, then they won't internalize them and they won't bring it forward. Which is, when you hear about meetings and concepts, trainings in particular, where people are like, oh, you only get like 20% of what you actually discuss within a training. That's why, because most of the stuff that comes up, especially when someone's just presenting at you, like I'm doing right now, you don't remember it. You don't think about it ever again because you didn't connect it to your past self. Readiness to learn is not the readiness that comes from like the stages of change. Instead, this is really just, how does this learning affect me right now? My personal identity, my personal roles, my personal needs. So if we're thinking about a participant, then we're thinking like, why does it even matter to me to learn this skill? Well, it's because you're a parent. Right. So your role as a parent means you have to learn how to deal with behavioral needs of your child or whatever the need might be. And orientation to learning is sort of connected to that, where rather than saying you have to learn English as a subject, you have to take literature, you have to take mathematics, adults don't learn that way. They learn by problem solving. And this actually is part of the reason why I wanted to introduce this, because that cohort deal, part of that is seeing other participants work through their problems helps adults to learn how to work through their problems. So they model based on real problem solving. And if they can even give feedback to problem solving, then that's even more beneficial. If you can have a little discussion about like what happened to that person and how that might change how they interact with their situation, then that can be even more internalized. And then the last one is motivation to learn. So adults are just less responsive to external motivators. You can't say like you have to do this because I don't know, because if you're not attending school, then you'll go to jail. Like that isn't super effective. Instead, they need to be internalized. So that means we need to help them to develop that role. We need to help them to understand that their identity as a learner is important, and create an environment where internal motivation is triggered in some way, that there's a reason to learn. It's not just, you know, just something that we say they have to do. So even a judge saying to them, you have to learn this thing, does not actually motivate them to learn that. And I could see this for myself. I have multiple graduate degrees. I am a great independent learner, right? So I have the adult learning experience. I know how to learn things fast and well, and I don't unless I have the motivation to do it, right? I have a list of virtual trainings, 97 miles long, and I will not learn a single thing from any one of them unless I really have a reason, unless I'm like, oh, we're going to talk about learning today. I'm going to go review that. So I think all of our participants are the same way, and so are the professionals. So when I'm wondering about why aren't people going to these trainings or what isn't involved, I'm really thinking about how can we internally motivate folks to feel like there's a benefit to them personally in doing that work moving forward. And then we also have social learning principles. This one's really fast, and then we'll move into some more discussion. So this is, social learning is really something that all primates do, all people do, and it's really 4 stages. So you see something happen, and we call that a stimulus. So you see something happen, you internalize that and think, okay, I saw something, I'm bringing that into my brain. Brains love new stimuli, so they bring it into their brain, and in some form of internalization happens. So, if you see a bumblebee wandering around a flower, then you might think, oh, that's a bumblebee wandering around a flower. I know that they need sugar. That flower must have sugar. I'm going to look up that flower later and think about the sugar content of that flower. Like there's just like a little bit of internalized learning process where you're connecting it to your previous experience. And then from there, you might do some imitation. Doesn't really work with my bee example, but that's where we see something like modeling or shadowing. My favorite example of imitation is emotional regulation. So if we have stable emotions, then others will have stable emotions. If we blow our top off at the smallest thing, then others will blow their top off at the smallest thing. And it's not just a cognitive thing, it's an emotional thing. So one of the ways that we can help people is by being regulated ourselves. It's why there's so much of a push for self-care. When we think about our participants, oftentimes they've never been around someone who's emotionally regulated ever in their whole lives, and I can say that from my experience as a youth and young adult. And so being around someone who makes you feel calmer, you want to spend time with them, and you learn from that. And honestly, psychologists and social learning specialists don't know why that is. They just know that it happens. So you can see regulation sort of transferring laterally from person to person. And you can feel it in a group setting as well. Like it takes one person to change and ramp up a group. It takes one person to calm it down. It just is sort of the power of their regulation skills. And then the last stage has to do with feedback. So when you're doing that imitation and it works, then you're like, oh, cool, I'm going to keep doing that. If you're doing that imitation and you get some sort of feedback, and I'm not talking about feedback verbally, it could be just a look that someone gives you, like, why are you doing that? Like, what is that comfort level? Is there belonging? Are you feeling like when you're doing this thing that's new to you, that there's a response to it? Then that creates a loop. And that feedback loop makes that person either continue to do that or stop doing it. And it happens pretty fast when we're talking about social learning. If you're a person who likes to try new outfits, you see something that someone wears, you put it on, and someone immediately is like, what are you wearing? You're never going to wear that again, even if you thought it was cool. And the reverse is also true. You get one compliment, and all of a sudden that becomes like a staple in your wardrobe, even though it wasn't necessarily something you would have chosen otherwise. And those feedback loops sort of persist. So hitting the right mark, like getting in there right in that early imitation stage, is a really important part of social learning. So a few different things that I want us to sort of chat about is is considering how the impact of our sort of smaller, less professionals, geographic distribution, and small areas impact professionals, community members, and experts. And an example of some ideas that we might think about talking about is our tribal communities oftentimes are asked to do lots of tasks, oftentimes for free. This happens with other minority communities as well, where in the time period where everyone started doing tribal land acknowledgements, one of the fastest things that people would do is like, oh, I know a tribal member, I'm going to ask them to do it. Right? Which kind of dilutes the purpose, and it also means that they're doing a lot of free work, and that lots of people are asking small groups. So the Lower Elwha tribe, which is right down the street from me, has about 900 active members on a regular basis. That's not a lot of people to bring from, and yet they're asked all the time to talk about their cultural resources to other people in the county. And that doesn't mean they're not willing to, but last I counted, the number of committees that our county is asking a tribal member to come and be a part of is somewhere around 15 or 16, and there's probably 2 or 3 experts that are actually able to do that, and then it's volunteer work, and then we add to that the things that we're asking to do. So sometimes we could consider asking one professional to work with multiple courts, and that would it's a lower bandwidth sort of opportunity. Resources our community are at a premium, and oftentimes it seems like we're at triage level rather than actually supporting families in the way we need to. So if there are ways to triage to the most high risk families, then we can potentially have a greater impact. This one's sort of more of a question for like HCA and those sorts of folks, but it's still, I think, relevant to these sort of discussions. And then additionally, ideas, things that you're thinking that might be relevant to these topics. So originally, my plan was that we would have some breakout rooms, but we have a pretty small group today. Totally understand that, especially after changing the timing. But I would like to just have some discussions about any partnerships that you all have seen or would like to have across county lines. And if there are any areas that you could see that state support would be helpful. So what would help you to reach out to, I don't know. So let's see, we have Skagit folks, right? I happen to know Whatcom really well. And I know that Whatcom and Skagit work together pretty often. So some partnering with Skagit and Whatcom happens already, but maybe doesn't happen in all the ways it could. So, that's one thing that I think of. I know Jefferson and Clallam are working on some ways that they can create partnerships. There's a lot of different ideas. So I'm going to just give you a few seconds to sort of think. And if there are people who are super chatty, then go ahead and unmute yourself and have a little chat, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Well, I'll just add one thing to one of your lists, Megan, on the baseline in terms of relevant issues. I mean, you kind of hit on it, but I guess for me personally, an important factor is that dependencies are a really small part of what I do. So dependencies are like 10% of what I do. And so I feel like this comes up a lot because I want to be doing everything in every category of the things I do, and yet that can feel impossible. And so I think, I don't know for other, people who play other roles in the dependency process, if that's true or not, but I assume there's some amount of that in any small rural community that, this is not the only thing you do.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jason. I just wanted to introduce myself. I am in Skagit. I am new to this position here within the last week. I come from Snohomish County, though, where I've been the adult recovery court coordinator for the last couple of years. So sort of the same, but obviously a lot of differences. I mean, Snohomish County definitely has some rural areas, but Skagit way more so. And then also I lived in Whatcom County for many years prior to this too. So I'm kind of like the whole I-5 corridor there I'm familiar with. This is my first time actually working in Skagit. And like I said, I've been here, this is my 4th day in the office. So I'm learning all the sorts of, the challenges that go along with working in rural communities. And how just differently things operate here as opposed to in Snohomish County. There are some pretty jarring contrasts I've noticed right out of the gate. One of the main ones being sort of the more the prevalent conservative culture, more so in the courts here, where we're running. And I've found that we seem to be running into some opposition from things like the prosecutor's office, just in terms of wanting to run a more punitive program, despite how that aligns or does not align with best practice standards.
Yeah.
Super frustrating. And again, this is in my 4 days so far.
You're not wrong, though. That's okay.
My first day in the program, so we just participated in a program tune-up hosted by All Rise and NDCI down in Tukwila last week. My our Judge Raquelme, had applied for that a while back and been approved. So it's sort of a big deal. There's a few other counties there too. Was Grays Harbor there? I don't know. There was like four others, but it was a 2-day thing down in Tukwila where they send in a team from All Rise.
And your county and Skagit to me, just makes a lot of logical sense. Kim Schuster the coordinator there is awesome. And I'd be super happy to facilitate a meeting with you all and just see if there's some ways that you can build some connection, because they are both courts that have small participants, but they do tend to have a lot of crossover between those two counties. You have a lot of people that live on the southern part of Whatcom and the northern part of Skagit or in Anacortes, and then they go to Bellingham and back and forth. And then on top of that, just thinking about that idea of, if you want to build a cohort of professionals, you want to build a cohort of participants, you just need more physical people to do that. And you might find a caring partner in Kim when it comes to the conservative rhetoric within the courts that makes things a little bit complicated. So highly recommend chatting with her. Always happy to connect you in that way, but then also just thinking about, if there are things like pairing your alumni group together that might make your work a little bit easier for bringing in peer support members, or the professionals on the team, having those attorneys connect with other attorneys that are doing this work, that are doing it in a different way, can be really transformational. Because, as much as I appreciate the work of attorneys, I don't really know what they're doing. I only know what they tell me that they are doing. Whereas when one attorney talks to another, I think that can make a real difference. And we do have several attorneys that, have been working with family treatment courts for decades, and have like a real good idea of like what their practices are. And then we have other attorneys that kind of come on and off. And I think that they actually have a bigger challenge because they're working with this adversarial system 80% of the time, like Katie was mentioning, that the actual FTC work is a really small part of that work. And so even just changing your brain to think about it differently, I think, is really complicated. And then one other thing that's relevant probably to both of you, Katie and Jason, and probably everyone, which is why we're talking about, is our next meeting of rural courts. We're hoping to bring in Judge Owens, who works in Iowa. He's retired mostly now. And then there's a few different folks who are in Colorado who I met recently, who have both worked with what they call an infusion model, which is sort of a in between FTC and dependency track. So what they've done is, when someone doesn't want to come into their family treatment courts, then they created, but they still need more. They need more than they're getting. So particularly, we know 75 to 80% of our cases have SUD as a factor. And we know that those cases tend to not work out very well if they don't get extra assistance. And so if we're looking at the statistics, then we say, okay, this is a family that has high risk SUD. They're in a high need environment, but they do not want to go into FTC. There are probably lots of reasons for that, but we're going to ask them to be in this mandatory program. And that mandatory program is the infusion program, where they're not meeting biweekly or every other week, but maybe they have every month staffing, or maybe they have every other month of staffing. So it's more than the 6-month dependency review period, but it's less than an FTC commitment, and a little bit more wraparound services, though not the full wraparound services. And it's sort of an approach that they're working with in those rural areas where you only have a few participants, and if they don't want FTC, but they still need those services and kind of active efforts, essentially, then we can build that in a little bit more easily. And because there's such a need, and it's very clear that there's a need, then they were able to find ways to make that mandatory, which I think is, I hate to do more mandatory programs for families, but when it comes to some of it, it's working for them. So that's something we're going to learn a little bit more about next time, as a idea option, something to sort of spin around in your communities. Sorry, I'm going to cough for a minute. So go ahead and unmute yourself. If Megan or Katrin, I know how to say your name. I'm sorry. If either of you had anything you want to share, or other folks, give me just a second.
Jason, did you say you're doing your family treatment court and drug court in Skagit? I didn't hear what you said in terms of what your role is.
Yeah, my position covers both. Mhm.
And
whereas Palmish County, we did adult, so family is new to me. That's what I'm kind of learning right now.
And how does your organizational structure there work? Like who do you report to? Where are you in the system?
I report directly to our judge.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas in Snohomish County, we had a program administrator who was my direct supervisor, Jamie Reed in Snohomish. She's awesome. Yeah.
So we're just starting a family treatment court in San Juan County, and we have a drug court. And previously our drug court case manager was our district court probation officer. I mean, we're used to sort of doing things across boundaries because that's the only option that we have. So that's how we created drug court, was with our district court probation providing case management. But now we got additional funding approved to have a new position that will be case manager for both family treatment court and drug court. But that position actually is a juvenile court probation counselor, because that was how it lined up best. So our juvenile court administrator, which we now have renamed, she actually supervises that person. So we've done a lot of different kind of cross boundaries. But the reason I asked the question initially was I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this kind of collaboration with changes in the drug court and drug possession laws. And so I think having those partnerships between limited jurisdiction courts and superior courts is going to be essential, because drug courts mostly have lived in superior court, but because things are now getting charged as misdemeanors, there's not a natural fit there, and we have to figure out how to help people. So
yeah, I think that's it's a critical point, and really understanding like how we can work with these newly established laws and how they've changed our system. Because another big one is HB 1227, and just thinking about so Jason, you said you're new to family law, so I'll give you a little tiny HB 1227 thing. There's lots of stuff going on about it, but essentially the idea behind HB 1227 was to reduce unnecessary removals of children from their homes. And in other states that have done this sort of work, what's really happened is they have broken off and established essentially a in-home dependency track, where you can have an established dependency, but there's never a removal, or they just have more services to the family up front. And for us, that shelter care process is kind of like this long investigation, well, not really long, but longish investigation process, and then you establish dependency. But that's also an opportunity for us to get lots of services into families. So we have to find ways to bridge that gap, essentially.
And actually, I agree, Megan. I mean, I think that family treatment court is a perfect fit for in-home dependency, because kids are remaining in the home,
exactly.
And families need more support. So having more frequent case management and court appearances makes perfect sense with in-home dependency.
Exactly.
But
yeah,
I think we haven't seen yet how that gap will be bridged in terms of the actual filing of in-home dependencies and how that's going to be pursued. I mean, I haven't had a new shelter care since the law changed. So I I don't know on our end. I'm sure DCYF is figuring it out in the interim, but I don't know what that's going to look like.
But I do think that there are ways that we can bridge those gaps. And one of those ways is by just widening out the idea network, having more time for brainstorming between counties and between some of our courts of lower jurisdiction, our courts that are, even the criminal drug courts, there are a lot of the same folks. You have courts, we're seeing more than ever people who are in the adult criminal courts who have dependency cases, and how we can interact with a family treatment court. And a lot of our courts, even the big ones, so I don't know about Snohomish and how well, I know that you have more connections, or you did, than other courts, but a lot of our courts don't really have a way to deal with that. If you're in a small county and you have lots of different people that are actually, they're all the same people, then actually that's easier, right? So Jason is the person who's talking to them from family side and adult side, and you could just be like, well, judge, turns out they're already in treatment for adult court. Let's just count that for this thing. But I think it's complicated, and the structures are definitely built to silo those things, not built to cross across those boundaries. Yeah, so I'm wondering about well, any next steps. So what could we do that would be assistive? Like, so San Juan County, I know you're kind of out there. You're far away from everyone. Beautiful, but far away. And if you were thinking about like the needs as you are building your court out for outside ideas and interest in brainstorming. So if we just think about professionals, then what are the needs and what would be helpful to your team?
Well, I just think as many partnerships as possible. I don't have a specific item, but that can be done remotely. I think we are a prime example of everything we do at this point is remote or hybrid at a minimum. And I was thinking more on the participant side. As we are starting, we're going to have 1 or 2 participants. So having a way for them to connect with peers in other counties remotely, I think would be huge. It wouldn't be an alumni group because they would be new in the program, but it would be people to talk with who are having a common experience. So, and we have set up, conference rooms here where people can use the room to do court-related appointments. Nice. And so they could come to that space and engage with people in other places. I just think that's going to be key for us to be successful, because being the only person is not going to fulfill some of those needs in terms of the group benefits.
Yeah. I love that you've set up remote rooms for those courts. I've heard of a few different courts doing sort of satellite, and then also thinking about how they could connect to other people. So when I say alumni groups, typically our alumni groups that are most effective are actually doing services for current participants, right? So you have like the folks from Parent for Parent who will run an alumni group that is all of the parents that have graduated and done great things that come in, and they'll do things like have cookie making kits for the kids in the current group, so they can hang out with the parents, and you can all the kids can hang out together and make cookies, or they'll have picnics, or just community things that are sober, they are friendly, and they're all people who create that sense of belonging. But again, if there's only one alumni, then it's kind of an awkward picnic. So if we did that in a region as opposed to doing it just for one group, then it's a little bit more accessible. And if you do it virtually, it might be even more so. So
well, just sort of where I personally just chosen as a jumping off point is just to launching this like community mapping project, right? Of just trying to find out what the resources are available to me that to our program that I might not be aware of, which was an idea that got kicked off at our operational tune-up, which I just kind of took and ran with. It was super helpful and has been. It's just like establishing those relationships, right? Like building a relationship with the Recovery Cafe that just opened in March.
Yeah.
We had a great relationship with the one in Everett. Back when I was in Snohomish County, they're a great partner for things like hosting events and sending clients down there just to kind of immerse in a recovery community. So I'm going to go meet with them this week and just try to form those kinds of things. So just really forming a base of resources and other community members who are like-minded are going to be valuable resources for the people in our program.
Yeah. So
I'll just add
really,
one on that note, Megan. I mean,
yeah.
I think small courts are already well adapted to do that kind of thing. I mean, I have review hearings much more frequently than every 6 months because we're
Yeah.
small and we can be nimble.
Yeah.
So, I mean, ours,
Yeah.
I wouldn't call that exact name, but we create, kind of better like one size, something that fits the individual rather than just doing one size fits all. So I just put that there.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're trying to look for is how we can do that. And then from, our level to take that and say, like, here's an example of this working really well, which is hard when you have rural areas and there's no data, it's like it's the data of
Mhm.
one family. But yeah, no, I would really appreciate if you were at that conversation, and really just thinking about how we can be nimble, be individualized, be careful about how we're spreading resources and how we're taking care of each other. So love that. All right. Well, we will see you all again soon. And I do hope that you have a really good rest of your week.